we're going to be talking about some heavy topics today, and I want to remind you to give yourself grace, give yourself space, and just kind of allow yourself to be open to hear my message that I have to say today. I'm not going to be talking specifically about just my personal experience. I want to give all this information to you guys. None of this information or the things I'm going to be sharing with you is original work. This is all stuff that through my whole year of self-healing journey, I came across all this information. When I got to the end of everything, I felt like it was so critically important. This stuff should be taught in schools. These things, parents should know these things when dealing with their children, and lovers should know this about their partners, understanding that maybe they have trauma. This is something that is really personal for me. This is something that I was not aware of any of this stuff until about a year ago, when I actually had someone that's pretty close to me have a conversation and let me know. They stepped outside of themselves and they took a moment to be vulnerable, and they told me that the way that I was speaking to them was inappropriate, right? And my first immediate reaction is like, okay, right? Like, how dare you try to question me? Like, I know myself, right? Like that, you can kind of feel that, right? Like that, like, wow. But I was like, maybe I need to pause for a minute. Maybe this person has something that, maybe, right? I've always felt that questioning things was really good. And so I was like, I'll question it. But also in the back of my mind, I was like, you know what? I'm going to do some research on this. And because I want to prove this person wrong, that the way that I'm reacting, the way that I'm responding is appropriate, right? Like, do what I say, do what I want, right? I want control of the situation, and I want things to go my way, the way that I think is right. Fast forward about a year later, and I don't even know what the heck I was even thinking back then, thinking the way that I was. I have a lot of shame and a lot of guilt built around everything that I've uncovered and learned, but I cannot stress to others out there that this is super important for people to at least keep an open mind, especially if you're somebody that keeps coming across situations or other people that you just butt heads with, right? You're just always constantly coming into issues or stress, and you just don't understand, right? Like, why does this person coming to attack me? Why is this happening? And, your first question is always is it me? Is it me? Right? And of course it's not, right? Because you as a person, you're probably not intending to react the way that you're actually reacting. You may not even be aware that the way that you're reacting is not authentic for you, right? Maybe it's a learned behavior that you just have auto-cued, that when somebody upsets me, I react to them, right? That reacting is not a true authentic response. And I want to talk about that. So if you've been struggling, maybe this is the video for you. Here you go. Please listen to what I have to say. Obviously, you can always throw out whatever you don't want to use. I really recommend getting a journal, something that you want to write in, and your favorite writing utensil. Maybe pick your favorite color or something, right? And I want you to write through the video things that speak out to you, questions that you may have. It's super important to actually write out your thoughts, because you can actually analyze them later and see your perceptions if you have any. And then also it helps you kind of digest and process through thoughts that maybe you didn't realize that you have. Jumping right into it, first slide here that we have PTSD, right? And we're not just going to be talking about PTSD today. We're going to be talking specifically about trauma, dealing with emotional trauma and healing from that trauma, right? But PTSD kind of ties into that. So for those who understand, no explanation is necessary. For those who don't understand, no explanation is possible. If you're not aware of these issues, right? And not just you, but the people around you, right? Because you're not the only one that is probably dealing with this issue. The more that you start to kind of open your mind and start to see this, you'll start to kind of understand from other people's perspectives what's going on for them. You know, they could have experienced trauma and they're reacting to that trauma instead of responding to the situation at hand or to the people at hand. You know, it's not always our fault. And especially with trauma, it's not our fault. It's not your fault. It's not your parents' fault. It's just, we were doing the best that we could at the time with the skills that we have, and those skills are outdated. We need to update those skills. Okay, so what is trauma? Psychology Today says, quote, trauma is a person's emotional response to a distressing experience, end quote. So going through a very stressful, frightening, or distressing event creates trauma, especially if we felt that we had to go through that trauma by ourselves and through that situation alone. So this typically happens when we're children because we feel kind of alone. We've went through situations alone. Sometimes our parents aren't always there to help us, so unbeknownst to anybody involved in the situation, the trauma just kind of happens. But when we experience the trauma, the body is very interesting in the way that it deals with the trauma. If you're not able to fully process it in the moment, then the body will hold on to it until you can process it at a later time. But for a lot of us, we never learn to actually process that trauma or process the emotions specifically is what happens. So trauma, there's this kind of stigma against the word trauma. Trauma is not a bad word. If you are new to trauma and you haven't really seen people talk about it or whatever, welcome. I hope that this video is informative for you and that you're able to find something that maybe you've been seeking for a while, and this might just be the video for you to find your answers. So is trauma real? So traumatized brains, when you have trauma that happens, especially at a young age as your brain is developing, you can see from the image that there's one person's brain where it has been normally functioning developed, and the other brain that is not, because that brain experienced trauma. Through time, you can definitely get a healthier brain, but trauma kind of it's there. You can see it in the brain. It is real. So let's discuss the parts and the functions of the brain. So at the base of the brain is the brainstem. This is considered the survival state of the brain. This is where the reptilian kind of thinking comes from, the, you know, get food, get water, you can breathe, you can survive, you're alive. Then you have the next part of the brain, the second part of the brain. This is your limbic system. This is where emotions are produced. This is where your emotional state comes from. And then you have the third and final one, and is the fleshy part of the brain that everybody associates with like the picture of the brain. It's the prefrontal cortex, the lobe. It's the executive part of the brain. It's where the logical thinking comes in and is able to help you process through things in a logical manner. So with the brain, as you're growing and developing, if you experience trauma at any point as the brain is developing, sometimes you can have trauma get stored in the survival part. Sometimes you can have it get stuck in the emotional part. And the brain just did not have a way to develop processing through stressful situations. Especially as a child, you think about a child, you know, dealing with very big situations and expecting children to be able to think logically like an adult, but that part of the brain just has not developed yet. And so since it wasn't able to process the information, it will store it until it can actually process it later. So then let's talk about like not just ourselves, but let's kind of look at everybody as a whole, right? If we're not the only children that are growing up that have experienced trauma, there are bound to be many others, and it seems to be kind of a cultural thing. And you'll kind of see lately in our culture, in our society, of this like, you know, wokeness of emotional mental health and self-awareness and emotional healing, and I'm super here for it. But there's so many people out there that have been hurt and that are hurting people because they're hurt and they're not aware of it because we didn't realize that there was a problem that we needed to process later. We're just expected to, like you see the parent talk to their child and, they're having a tantrum in the store. Their brains don't understand. And so we're talking to that child as if, be an adult, handle this situation well, expecting them to do so. And it's just not going to happen. And so that gets stored. So crazy makes you crazy, right? Hurt makes you hurt other people. And that's the wrong way to go about it, but it's okay. Like it's something that we all can heal and work through and process, because that information just is stored in the body. We need to learn how to properly process it now, and then you can learn what you need to from it. And then that trauma is no longer stored in the body. You can then use it to move on and progress in whatever situation that you need to, that you weren't able to at that time. Trauma decontextualized in a person over time can look like personality. For me and my personal situation, we just thought that I was just angry and I didn't trust people, I didn't like people, that was my personality. But I didn't realize that the trauma that I had experienced was keeping me from being my most true, authentic self. And that's where the problem arises, because I'm not living authentically, and then in a very weird, subconscious, weird way, you almost tend to hate yourself because you're not being yourself. So trauma can affect you as a person, but then let's look at trauma in a family, right? Say you have multiple people in a family that learned a very specific type of way to deal, and that became trauma. That trauma can actually transcend through the generations and through the family members. And so decontextualized trauma in a family can look like family traits. It's just, oh, that's just what Uncle Bill does. That's just how it is. No, that should never be the answer. If it's just that's how it is, it's because you're turning a blind eye to poor management of processing either emotions or situations or stress. And then let's look at trauma in a group of people, right? Outside of the single person to the family, let's look at a culture of people. Trauma decontextualized in a group of people looks like culture. It becomes normal and normalized and acceptable behavior. But someone has to come along and say, look, we're doing things kind of archaic here. Not that it's wrong, but just we can upgrade now. We can react differently, and we can process things differently. Let's do that. And it takes one person to grab one other person and bring them along. And that's where the healing starts. So hurt people, hurting people, love is not all you need, right? In a family, in a relationship, you all think that like, oh, well, I love you, right? Like you just accept the bad behavior or the uncomfortable behavior. That shouldn't happen, right? We need mutual respect. You need support. You need trust. You definitely need boundaries. You need people to be there when it matters. You need space to grow and acceptance when you do. You need people to show their love in a way you can understand. You need all those things. That is actually like part of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that you need that love, that support, that community, the true acceptance of self. And then that allows you to accept yourself as well. So trauma and brain development, where does it kind of all start? For a lot of people, it starts actually in childhood. You're just involved in a stressful situation. You felt like you were alone to process it. As a child, you don't have the brain development in order to deal with that stressful situation, so then it gets stored. So for a normal person, typical development starts at the survival stage, right? You're a baby, you're brought home from the hospital, your parents have to feed you and give you water and clothe you. As a newborn baby, that survival stage is very short if you're given those needs pretty quickly, right? So then you move on to the next stage of regulation. That's schedule. It just has to keep occurring. You will feel safe and secure in part of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Then it moves on to social and emotional. As that child grows up, right, they need that connection. And that's why it's so important for parents to actually look at their children, play with them, and, you know, connect with them. We all need connection. If you don't get it, it will cause problems later on in your development stage. And then that final stage is cognition, where the child will finally like look at you, wake up, and you hope that they become self-aware. But for the people that don't have the typical development, you can see the other side of the triangle where it's flipped basically upside down. The survival part of the triangle is way bigger at the bottom because it takes way more to like create the survive, like this, the security and the safety. And then it moves on to regulation, right? Because the survival was way bigger of a portion of time, the regulation takes way longer because they may not have a secure sense of attachment to like safety and security. So it's going to take you a little bit longer to feel safe and secure. It's going to take more time. And then on top of that, your social and emotional needs, you may not be as open and feel like you can be vulnerable to connect with other people, right? Because your survival and regulation was so much longer and so much more needed than typical development. And then you'll see at the top of the triangle, the cognition way smaller because the ability to actually reach self-awareness is that much farther to get to because you're still working on the base that you didn't get. Are stuck at that base for so long, you kind of get stuck in survival mode. So you can see the tweet from someone. They said, my dad said, quote, often trauma keeps us at the age we experienced it. A lot of people are exactly the age their hurt came from. So for you, my question is, where do you think for you that happened? Where do you think that trauma, that stressful situation, the last one that you were able to like maybe kind of like halfway successfully deal with, what age was that at? Because those tools that you used to survive through that survival mode, you might be stuck at that level, right? And if you are not personally free to be yourself in the most important of all human activities, which is the expression of love, then life loses its meaning. You will never find yourself. You will never get that cognition or that self-awareness. So the question you need to ask yourself now is, do I have trauma? And the only person that can answer this is you. I can't tell you, no one else can tell you, only you can, because it comes from within. So if you're really not sure at this point in the video, there's a couple questions that you can ask yourself. Some of them are very general. So like if you have difficulty maintaining social bonds, concentrating, sleeping, focusing, those ones, they could be tied to other things like ADHD. Surprisingly, ADHD symptoms and trauma symptoms are so closely related that you might need to seek professional help to determine for sure if it's complex PTSD or ADHD. But probably one of the biggest things that you'll notice is if you have a difficulty regulating emotions. So let's kind of break that down, regulating emotions. Let's ask yourself some questions here. If you're not happy with yourself, if you worry that you're a burden or that you're toxic or that you don't matter, it's more than likely because you've been traumatized or that you've experienced trauma at some point in your life. If you struggle to make it out of bed, think straight, get motivated or distracted, it's probably because you experienced trauma at some point. And then the big one, have you ever been told that you're too dramatic or emotional? Has anyone wondered why you trust no one? For me, I have trust issues. Why you analyze every person's smallest behavior. Why you're paranoid of the most minor signs of history repeating itself. Because you've probably experienced trauma. That trauma has kind of tinted your perceptions on situations and people specifically. And the biggest thing to realize is that it's not your fault. It's not your fault. So I'm gonna go ahead and do a 1 minute pause here. I want you to go ahead and bring out your journal. And if you haven't already, if you haven't been writing notes this entire time, and I want you to pause this video for 1 minute and I want you to write down what's one thing that stuck out for you so far. Thank you so much for spending that 1 minute for yourself, because that's really what this is for you, right? I can't tell you for you your situation. All of this comes from internally for you. So I appreciate you taking the time to be honest and reflect for yourself. So jumping right back in, let's talk about the effects of trauma. So 7 signs that you need emotional healing, because maybe you're just not sure. Maybe you kind of feel like maybe there's some trauma, or maybe something kind of flagged up for you maybe as I was speaking. So here's 7 signs that you need emotional healing. 1, you think negatively. 2, you're not intuitive anymore, or maybe you've never experienced intuitiveness. Maybe you've just never learned to trust yourself. Number 3, you lack trust, compassion, and empathy, not only for yourself, but for others. Number 4, you overthink a lot. Number 5, you react, you don't respond. For me, this was a huge one. My emotions would force me to react in a way that maybe I just felt like I had no control over that reaction, so I wasn't really responding in an authentic way. And then number 6, you have difficulty in letting go. And number 7, you might feel depressed. And for me, I had depression and anxiety because I lacked control in my life. Trauma can keep you stuck in a loop from your past. You'll be 27 with a 12-year-old mindset and process. That's because of the reason you people please, overextend yourself, or stay in places longer than you should have. Your inner child is screaming, finally, someone loves me. Because that trauma, you just felt like you were alone, that no one was there to support you, and that you had to do it all by yourself. And when you experience those moments, it can create trauma, but almost a distrust of others, and that you feel like you have to take it all on yourself. So people that experience trauma, usually they have people-pleasing tendencies or codependency issues, and there's all of these problems, and they stack up, and it just feels like it's a lot. But the thing that you need to understand is that this is a no blame game, right? You're not the one that chose this. It's not like you did this to yourself, but also you need to look at it accurately, that it's not like your parents did this to you either, right? We only do what we know. You can only react or respond in a way that you know is appropriate or that you've learned in the past. So let's talk about a story. It's kind of silly, but it will kind of maybe give you a picture of what I'm talking about here. So a mother was preparing her Sunday dinner, and her daughter was helping her in the kitchen. The mother took the roast out from the fridge and began to process, the carrots, the onions, the potatoes. She takes the roast out, and she cuts about an inch off of the far right side. Her daughter, watching her mother intently, asked, "Why are you doing that?" The mother finished up her task and then thought for a moment. "I don't know, it's just something my mother always did when I was growing up." Right? We don't question things, we don't think about them, right? It takes a child to ask such an innocent question. Why? Why do you do the things that you do? So a few days later, the mother gets a call from her mom, and she asks her, "Mom, when I was younger, you used to do roast for dinner, and you remember you would cut the far end of the roast off? Why did you do that?" Her mother laughed and told her, "My pan was too small and couldn't fit the entire roast, so I cut the roast to fit." So for all of those years, her daughter was cutting off the end of the roast, wasting the end of the roast. Sometimes it's super important to question why we do the things that we do. Why do we think the way that we think? Why do we behave the way that we behave? If you don't question things, then you never know if maybe it's time to upgrade and update how we do things. It's super important. So when you're from a dysfunctional family, the thing that you need to understand is that healthy boundaries are viewed as threatening. Making an observation, expressing an expectation, refusing to be involved in chaos, or expressing a different viewpoint will likely lead to you being labeled as mean, funny acting, or weird, because you're reacting differently than what they know, right? And different is scary. Different is usually viewed as bad. Not going along with the typical chaos can seem like you're trying to make waves in the family, and the truth is you are making waves. You're choosing to react differently. You're breaking the cycle of dysfunction, and that isn't always well received by others. But it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's just different, and that's okay. We're all meant to be different. And the main thing that I feel like we all really need to understand is that one doesn't have to operate with great malice to do great harm. The absence of empathy and understanding are sufficient. Just because you don't understand, right? That otherness is scary. It's different, so we think it's bad, but not necessarily. You just don't know what's on the other side. And with that, you just need to learn. You need to know more. So trauma happens and harms us, but I often wonder if the worst trauma is the second wave, when your story is misbelieved, mistrusted, and maligned. May your story find safe harbor in the presence of people who will honor both your vulnerability and resilience. As you start to do this personal self-healing journey that you are partaking on, you might come across other people that maybe don't really jive well with what you're saying or thinking or feeling. And you know what? That's okay. Because your journey isn't to be validated by other people, right? It's not for me to, for me and my journey, I didn't need to go to my parents to get validated from my point of view of my childhood, right? That's my point of view, and I do understand that as a child, things are skewed, and our perceptions are in a childlike mind, right? I can only understand them from that perspective. I don't need to go to my parents and have them skew or invalidate my perceptions, because that's not helpful. That just gets you back into the feeling of you can't trust yourself. And that's the thing that we're working against, is we want to learn to trust not only ourselves, but our fellow people, right? Because some point in that trauma that happened, you felt like you couldn't trust, you didn't get help, you didn't get the support that you needed. But now you realize you need to go back, and you do need to show yourself that you need that support and to give yourself that support. And you can only do that with your internal work through your personal self-healing journey. You can only get that from within. You can't get that from outside. So let's break that down of personal biases and perceptions, because we've talked a lot about them, but maybe you're just not aware of that you have personal biases, that you have personal perceptions, and that every single person that you meet and talk to and know, they have their own personal too. There's a really intelligent guy, his name's Alan Watts. I'm gonna give you a quote, something that he said. "We seldom realize, for example, that our most private thoughts and emotions are not actually our own, for we think in terms of languages and images which we did not invent, but which were given to us by our society. We don't even know who we are without the people around us to tell us, right? We only see our perceptions, we only see our biases, and that's outdated technology. We don't know who we are without others. We look to others to learn how to react in situations. This is something that we learned as children, right? When we were children, we watched our parents and how they did things, and we learned in the same ways, right? And they learned from their parents, and they learned from their parents, and so on and so on. But if no one came along the way to question, oh, why do we do that way? Is that the best, economical way of dealing with that situation, of dealing with that person, of dealing with anything, right? Stress related. If we learn something and it's not the best way, we don't know any better, right? We'll just continuing on. Why fix something if it's not broken? But maybe you just don't know that it's broken. Maybe no one's ever questioned to see why it's broken, right? So let's talk about false perceptions. There are so many unique personalities and circumstances. How can we even begin to imagine that we, just us, one person, know how anything is for another person? What if that person lived a completely different life? Do you really feel that you have the answer to give to them to fix their life? Right? That's probably a false perception. We project our thoughts, our feelings, and emotions onto others. We think that they think exactly like us, but this isn't true. Nobody really thinks the exact same way. Take someone that's the exact same personality, they probably had a different upbringing. Maybe they never were affected by trauma, but maybe you were. So the way that you react, maybe it's not authentic, but then you try to give someone advice, that's probably not going to do well, right? So stay in your lane. Focus on your journey. Don't try to fix people or help people. Focus on yourself. Focus within. Once you fill up your cup, then you can empty your cup to others. And if you're a hurting individual and you go to enter a conversation with another individual that happens to be hurting as well, right? Because we're all just hurt people, hurting other people. If we get in a conversation with that other person and you're both projecting onto each other, right? Your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions of what you are assuming is going on, how can you even hope to communicate in the way that they need to be able to hear? What if they can't hear you and you're expecting them to validate you, but you're projecting your own emotions and your thoughts on them? Now the waters are all muddied, right? No one's being heard, no one's getting validated. It just kind of sucks for both people involved. Okay, so now what? Now that you know all this about trauma, now that you maybe feel like you've got trauma, some things that you need to work on, some things that you need to heal with, what's next, right? When we experience trauma, remember, we seem to pick it up like baggage. And it becomes part of us, right? We assume that this is part of our personality and that we need to bring this along, this stress, right? It's a learned response. You don't have to pick that stuff up anymore. You can let that go. We have to unlearn what we've learned so we can learn better skills and get better communication techniques so that we can communicate better, to allow every single one of us to step up to the table, to have a voice, to be able to communicate with each other, and to really have that like love for everyone that we're supposed to, right? Love for ourselves and love for our neighbors. Remember, I love every single one of you. I hope that you have a great day. Remember to spread kindness to others, and I'll see you in my next video.
Bye!
Bye! Bye, gumball!